Zimmerman, and I will be facilitating today's convening with Helen D. Michelle and our co-creation convening team. At the start of the pandemic in 2020, Brian was part of our team that mounted our virtual co-creation convenings during pandemic and protest. These convenings gathered together scholars and practitioners and visionaries of documentary from across the globe for dialogue for over 2 years. He was a loyalist to these gatherings and to the documentary community and to this community on the screen today. He was always irascible, to quote Elisa LeBeau, and incisive. Our group felt it was important to continue this tradition and mount this convening in his honor. Our gathering today is an informal, grassroots, collaborative, and participatory celebration. We invite you to share stories and tributes to our beloved colleague, Brian. We will work really hard to keep our session to 60 minutes. To ensure as many voices as possible, we ask that your stories and tributes do not exceed 2 minutes. There is no formal program. As we all know, Brian would have wanted a gathering that was ground up, informal, based on conviviality and collective spirit. So to join in and contribute, just raise your digital hand if you would like to share a story. It's easier for those of us on the producing end as we can see you rather than having to scroll through the chat. Now, we kindly ask that you rename yourself with your name and your location. Do feel free to contribute thoughts and links to written tributes about Brian or anything else that comes to mind in the chat. We will also be saving that. This event will be recorded because there are many people who cannot make it today. This event has been conceived and produced with a co-creation collaborative team of Helen D. Michelle, Mandy Rose, Dorit Nauman, Liz Miller, Judith Aston, Sandra Gaudenzi, and Elisa LeBeau, and I personally thank them for all of their behind-the-scenes producing of this. The sponsoring organizations are the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, iDocs in the UK, and the Park Center for Independent Media. Let me open up today's convening with a few words about Brian from our opening slide. And I have to share these words were done in a co-creative way. Brian Winston, stalwart friend, prolific author, rigorous producer, groundbreaking scholar, meticulous journalist, proud father, loving grandfather, brilliant professor, unwavering advocate, militant interrogator, steadfast colleague, fearless provocateur, formidable chef, tender partner, unwavering comrade, and so much more. I'd like to hand it over to Helen D. Michelle now.
Good morning, film community around the world. It's so nice to be here. All I want to say really briefly is that I was so moved by Patty's vibrant and really loving tribute to the man that we adored for how he listened, how he encouraged dialogue, and how he asked questions about new ideas and absorbed them, and how he gathered people together specifically to talk, to debate, to listen more, and not be afraid to speak their truths, even if they weren't everybody's truth. And that spirit that Brian gave both of us came out in any of the recent writings that we did together. And Brian, during the last 2 years, attended our pandemic global convenings, and he always inevitably added a spicy comment here and there to get the feathers up among all of the participants. Patty, I want to say that you really caught how Brian was so important as someone who was speaking out for solidarity, for vitality, for fearlessness. I want to say that over and again, fearlessness about the form of documentary that we find so captivating and cannot contain in any kind of bottle or any kind of cage. I'm sad right now just recalling how uplifting and strong I always felt after coming away from any of my public encounters with Brian. I wasn't a close friend, but every time I did see him, I just felt that kind of energy and spirit coming forth. So I just want to say that I am always going to remember Brian. Whenever I'm inclined to make a statement, I will always ask a question. Thank you.
Excellent. Alyssa, I think you had a message to read from somebody.
Yeah, Elizabeth Cowie couldn't be with us, and she wanted to be sure that she was somehow participating. So she sent me some words that she would have shared had she been able to join us. Elizabeth said, Brian always greeted me with a broad smile and kind words, and I especially still cherish his enormous kindness to me when my sister died very suddenly from endocarditis in 2008, the heart infection that Brian had suffered, but which he had very happily recovered from shortly before. Brian's enormous intellectual legacy will continue to enrich documentary studies, and his generosity and humanity, and of course humor, will be loved. And I guess I'll add my little 2 minutes. It'll probably be less than 2 minutes. Just a little kind of funny story about meeting Brian. I think the first time I knew of his work, and I had seen him before. He was involved in NYU when I was a graduate student, or at least at the beginning of when I was a graduate student. But I didn't actually meet Brian, I think, until Bochum, until Visible Evidence Bochum. And it was kind of a classic encounter in that there was a session that we were all at, and in the front row was Brian, and I remember Michael Renoff, and possibly Michael Shannon, though you can let me know, Michael C, if it wasn't you. They were sitting in the front row, and they were kind of really engaged in the Q&A, and I noticed that it was just the three of them speaking to a guy on the panel. I can't remember who was presenting. And so after, I don't know, 20 minutes of this, I raised my hand to intervene. I'm going to say something. And I said something relatively rude, as is my wont, about, sorry to interrupt the patriarchs here, but, I think some other people may want to ask some questions. And Brian came up to me in a fury. There was literally steam coming out of his ears after the thing, having, been misidentified as a patriarch. And although I think Brian did have his moments where it was not a misidentification, I think I should say publicly here that I was very wrong at that moment to include Brian in that, because as you can see by the 6 or 7 women organizing this, Brian was an incredible supporter of women's thinking, women's work, women's writing, women's publishing. And I remember sitting next to him when he would listen to somebody who was really inspiring to him, usually a woman, and he'd say, oh, she's just such. That was good news for documentary studies, actually. Good news for our community. He was always kind of thinking in those terms. And I wish I had said that to Brian directly, but Brian knew, I think, how much I loved him and appreciated him, and I think we're going to hear more of the love in the room. For Brian Winston, there is definitely a Brian Winston-sized hole, or bigger, in the world now that he's gone.
Thanks, Elisa. And Michael Shannon, welcome.
Hello, everybody. 3 short memories. The first is to say that Brian was a man whose reputation went in advance of him. And I first heard about him long before I met him because he was at school with my elder brother. The second is, I think my favorite remark that Brian ever made was his admonition to Roger Grafe when he said, Roger, just because the sound recordist is underneath the table, it doesn't mean he isn't there. And the third memory is, I think it was the visible evidence in Cardiff, when he had a go at a mutual friend of ours, a documentarist called Paul Watson, and they had a full-blown slanging match in front of the whole audience, which everybody just sat back and enjoyed. That's all.
Thank you, Michael. Lucia? Are you there, Lucia?
I'm here. I was trying to find some picture from the conference of Brian,
Yeah.
so I'm digging out. So,
Would you like us to put someone before you while you do that? And we'll need you to
Yes,
turn your
please.
camera on
Yes.
so that we can spotlight you. So we'll go to Michael
I have-
Renoff next.
we have a major snowstorm here, so the connection is really poor at my house. That's why I'm no.
Okay,
but
we'll come back to you after Michael Renoff then. Michael?
Thanks, Patty, and thanks to the organizers. This is such a great opportunity to have this community together. We all shared Brian in common, and he was so important to all of us. There's so many things that I could say. I love the man deeply. Number one, of all things, I was introduced to him by Annette Michelson. It was at the SCS, before it was SCMS, in 1985. It was held at NYU on the steps of that building on Broadway. She said, I want to introduce you to Brian Winston. And I already knew who he was because I'd seen his Paper Tiger piece and I had read him, but it was, I still remember that moment. But it's just so odd that Annette, with whom I shared some things, but not that many, and Brian, with whom I shared so many things. The main thing I want to, so that to me is indelible. I want to remember, since I have such a small amount of time, I want to recall a moment that was a really joyous moment for Brian. And it reminds me, and I think all of us, how much he was about students, how much he was about teaching, how much he was about mentoring. 1994 was the second edition of Visible Evidence, and it was hosted at USC. And in order to make all of it work together better, Brian convinced me that he should come teach a class for us at USC. And I was just leaving my tour of duty as the chair of the department, and I said, sure, we can do that. So he taught a class, and the students really didn't know who he was in the beginning. But by the end, they were all completely enamored of this guy. They just thought he was the greatest, and they threw a party for him. Now that doesn't happen very often. It was a summer class. People were a little bit more relaxed, but I'll never forget this party. By the way, his family was also in LA. They did a house swap with Marcia Kinder, which, by the way, didn't go that well, but that's another story. This party, there was a big cake that was baked in his honor, and he was so happy because his students loved him, and they didn't love him because they had inherited knowledge of what he had done and who he was, but because he was just a thrilling teacher with so much energy and so much generosity towards all of them, because many of them were production people, and he related to them absolutely as well as the studies people. And that was always the case. And having been with them on many occasions in many places around the world, it almost never failed that someone from some far-flung place would come up to him and say, oh, Brian, thank you for that help. You were on my dissertation committee, or you read this essay, or you did something for me. He was the most generous scholar, and that we had a global reach. So watching him be happy and celebrated by these USC students back in 1994 is something I'll never forget.
Thank you so much, Michael. Before we bring Lucia on, Alan Schneider, will you please raise your digital hand so we can get you in the queue? Thanks, Michael, and we'll segue to Lucia now. Are you there, Lucia? Okay, we'll come back to Lucia. Carrie?
Okay, hello everyone. I want to just tell a very short story from sometime in the 90s when, as happened often, the education department at the British Film Institute, where I was the head of department, was struggling with the management who didn't really know what education was. He was a really staunch supporter of us. And I was frequently in trouble with the management. Brian had long been a very good friend and very good colleague, and at this time he was on the BFI's Board of Governors. I was in trouble for something or other, I can't remember what, and the governors were going to discuss it. It was that bad. Brian popped into my office just before the meeting, and he said he was going to intervene on my behalf and he was going to argue my case. And he said he knew very well that this was not going to do him any good at all. He might be chucked off the governors, or he would be maybe there was something he, wanted to, role he wanted to play that he wasn't going to be allowed to do anymore. I can't remember that either. The main thing I just remember is that he said, I'm going to do this because it's the right thing to do. And I just felt that was just encapsulated what a decent and fearless person Brian was.
Thank you so much. I want to bring in Alan Schneider. Alan Schneider, are you there? I understand you've had your real hand up. Alan? There you are, Alan. Alan, you're muted. So if you could unmute, that would be wonderful.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
That's great, okay. I think I probably have known or knew Brian longer than anybody else here because we started our secondary school, which is at the age of 11, together. So I knew him right through school days, and by the end of the school days, we were very, very close friends. One thing I want to say before a very short story, one thing I do want to stress, which I feel is not stressed enough, obviously, because of all the important work and all the wonderful effects he had on people, is that in my experience, he was the funniest person I knew, right through school days, and often we met afterwards, right through the years, when he was at Oxford, and either in latter years, if we didn't see each other so often, maybe once a year when he came to London, we would be exchanging emails and making phone calls. So I do feel that that point about him should not be lost, as it has been in one or two obituaries I have read. My very short story is that when he was 18 and last year at school, he was taking his Oxford exams. He also went in for a scholarship, not a scholarship, a competition, although they called it a scholarship, the prize for which was a lot of money, which would have obviously been very useful once he went up to Oxford. He didn't win it. The subject he chose was Eisenstein. He chose Eisenstein because his uncle was Mr. Charles Cooper, who was a film distributor, contemporary films in London, having left New York because of the McCarthy situation, and he had to get out of America. And he brought with him his wonderful collection, his catalogue of films. Brian therefore made use of this and made the subject of his essay Eisenstein. And to write that essay, he borrowed films of Eisenstein, all of them, from his uncle and Charlie Cooper. And I went with him from time to time up to what we call the West End in London, the centre of London, and we'd collect these films. And here we were, two 18-year-old schoolboys, going through the centre of London and getting on the train and going to his home with 4 or 5 reels of the most precious films at that time. Very precious, because apart from the National Film Theatre of the BFI, nobody was showing Eisenstein films because nobody else had them. And there we were, walking through London with these great cans, reels of Eisenstein films, virtually every one of the Eisenstein's major films. Brian would then go home and go through each reel literally frame by frame and point out this and point out another point, everything that he saw. And it certainly made me decide that the film world was not for me. I certainly didn't have that kind of eye, although I thought about it. The dramatic side I loved, but more perhaps, but I would never have been a technician as Brian was. So that's my little memory of him. Just one more little thing, if I may say so. In our days, school days, we were divided in latter years between arts and science. I did science, but was taken up with the arts. Brian did arts, but could have done just as well in science, as all the technology and the technical aspects of his books show, and I'm sure in his lectures too. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful to be here with you and 1 or 2 people like Michael Tannen, Bruce Fireman, who I know from Kilburn Grammar School, and also from a completely different world, Carrie Bazalgette. I remember her too. Thank you very much. I'm really enjoying all these tributes to Brian.
Thank you so much, Alan, and a big shout out to Alex Uhas, who helped me find you. Esther.
Very quick words. I met Brian in the early 2000s in one of the first film conferences I attended as I had recently started to teach at the University of São Paulo. And he was very inspiring. Talking to him after my presentation helped me to strengthen the kind of work that I'm still doing and dealing with documentary, with television, and with film, and trying to bridge my anthropology background into the consideration, especially with favela films, which was the subject of that conversation back then. We are going through very challenging times right now, and I think that if we can keep with Brian's engagement with transnational film and documentary, and he was so knowledgeable about like Brazilian film, and I felt I had to bring my Brazilian take on Brian, on his solidarity, and also to call attention to the very challenging times we are going through and to the role that this kind of network can have during these hard times. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Esther. And Bjorn.
Yes, thank you, Patty, for organizing this fantastic event online. I have known Brian, or knew Brian since the early 90s, I think, when I first started attending in international documentary festivals. But my main memory that I'd like to share with you was that when he visited us in Trondheim in the mid-90s, our department had come across a good lump of money, so we were able to invite pretty much who we wanted, and we did. And of course, Brian was on that list. Michael was there. Bill Nichols couldn't make it right then, but he was there earlier. So that year, my documentary course had some fantastic people to meet. And the seminar that we had with the title, The Documentary Turn, became really a fantastic experience. Brian was there, of course, and in his speech or his lecture that was very much characterized by the feud that he right then was in with those who held that that the documentary could possibly be objective, and his main opponent, of course, was Noel Carroll. And in that speech, he gave I suddenly realized what a performer Brian was. It was incredible. He was debating Noel Carroll, who was not there, of course, no fair, okay, but extremely funny. And he was doing both sides of the argument with himself. As he said, I will play the role of Eeyore, or Winnie the Pooh. But what came across was another Winnie the Pooh character, and that was Tigger, going at his opponents with vehemence and style. It was also there was also an episode there that I like to remember, because we almost might have lost Brian then, because we were at after the dinner, we were down at the Student Society, which is a student-owned and student-managed house, and we had a former chairman of that who was able to lead us well through all the strange places in that house and up on the floor and outside. And it was November, and it was chilly, and you of course you got a fantastic view of Trondheim by night there, but the curved floor was slippery, and I was able to grab onto Brian before he slid down and made a descent into the streets of Trondheim, and so I managed to secure that we had him for some more years. But the way that he accepted that challenge and gave that performance in that connection was very much Brian for me. And later, of course, I've always connected visible evidence with Brian, and to meet him, and he would turn up, oh, here's Björn, and okay, I was there. So I'm really happy to have had the possibility to be on this occasion and listen to all the stories and all the many facets of the person we knew as Brian Winston. Thank you.
Thank you, Bjorn. Coming to us from Trondheim, Norway, I believe. I have a reminder from our producing team that when you speak, if you start out just saying where you are located in the world, that would be really helpful to our participants today. Next on deck is Ian Christie.
Let me unmute. Okay. Hi, I'm like everybody else really pleased to be here. I'm Ian Christie. I'm in London, in North London at the moment. And I was just scrabbling around behind the study that you see behind me here to try and find a book of Brian's, which I always associate him with. But I think I was very touched by some things that two earlier speakers mentioned. One was that I never knew that Brian's uncle was Charlie Cooper. Charlie Cooper was a great figure in left cinema in Britain. I was a friend, a colleague. I was asked by his family to write his obituary when he died, and I never knew that Brian was related to him. That's a discovery. But like Kerry, who spoke earlier, I remember Brian's relationship with the BFI. He was a fearless governor. He was one of those people who didn't regard being on the board of governors of the BFI as some kind of honor. He regarded it as a kind of arena which he could speak his mind. And he was a very powerful voice on that body, which wasn't noted for its progressiveness. I guess I knew him at a number of different stages in his career. I felt very strongly after his death that his role as an author and as a theorist hadn't really been adequately recognized. I still think that one of his considerable number of books, Technologies of Seeing, is a terrific book. And I don't think it's ever really had its due. It really belongs up there with the work of Raymond Williams, Marshall McLuhan, all sorts of highly regarded theorists of the media. But Brian, coming to think about the history of technological innovation in moving image and in photography, he brought to it a very practical sense what had held back progression in the media. And I whenever I talk about the history of media theory, I always include Brian because I think he does belong there, and that's not sufficiently recognized. One of his last books, I think, or later books, was his documentary film book. And I remember he got in touch with me in some confusion and anxiety. He said, "We haven't got a book on Russian document. We haven't got a chapter on Russian documentary. Can you write one quickly?" And typically, of course, I said, "Well, okay, maybe I can try." And I remember that was the fastest chapter I ever wrote. Brian needed it, and it seemed like a good thing to do. It wasn't perfect by any means, but at least it was something that I could do because of his sense of it had to be there. I think one of the things that shaped Brian, which again, I think hasn't perhaps been mentioned enough, was his early experience working in television and in the BBC. He was part of a generation of people who came into the BBC through journalism, and like Tony Smith, the late lamented director of the British Film Institute, and they were, of course, friends and contemporaries. Like Tony, he had that sense of fearlessness. He was willing to wade in. And I think they learned that in the early days of television, when you really had to be a doorstepper. You had to be prepared to stick your microphone in, to grab people to interview them. Brian, I think, had and retained that quality of not really being cowed, not being afraid. He was always willing to wade in. He was one of the most unsubmissive people I think I've ever met. Show him a challenge, he would take it on. And that was true right to the end. One of the last stages of his career, which again, I was happy to know him in, was at Lincoln University. Lincoln University was a pretty late arrival amongst the universities of Britain. They invited Brian to become their first professor of film, and he accepted. Lincoln wasn't even an easy place to get to.
Excuse me, Ian, we have a lot of hands up. Could we just quickly wrap it up? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure. Just to say that Brian threw himself into Lincoln, and he really turned it into a hub, an unexpected, surprising, but very vital hub of media studies, media research. And it was wonderful to see him operating at a pretty advanced age in that new arena. He was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. And now we have Alex. Juhas, you're next in line.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you for organizing this. And my heartfelt condolences to Gail, who I see online, and to members of Brian's family. I may not know that you're a member of his family, but I feel for your loss, and I miss Brian as well. But I'm not necessarily a family member. I met him when I was in graduate school. He in the 80s, he was at NYU, and I first knew him as a student. A remarkable presence, but I will remember him as a colleague and a friend. And I wanted to say a little bit about his personality, although I think, we all know it, but maybe it's why we're here. And I see that picture that's been shared about him, and brings so much emotion, because I always felt emotion when Brian was in the room, because he had so much emotion, such a strange and delightful cluster of affect in this person, this bundle of energy, so much love, so smart, so loud, always in for a struggle, but very, very receptive and wanting to learn, so capable of listening too. So in those sort of dynamic moments that he was always sort of mounting, he was also receiving. And I was in a number of those dynamic encounters with him, which were just memorable, because his heart was in the ideas, and he wanted to continue to learn. So I appreciated the point about him as a theorist, and I felt like what I wanted to add in that regard is he and I found each other early in his work on the victim documentary, and thinking against that ignoble tradition that had organized so much production, but also thinking about documentary, and what it always in the room, what it meant for Brian, and then perhaps me, to think about the violence of the form and the indignities that it produced, and how to talk together and think together against that tradition, and to produce other modalities. And Brian would always do that. And I learned so much from watching him stand up for that position, and also engaging in conversations with many of us in the field. And just to end, for those of you who aren't part of documentary studies, many of us in this room are, and Brian was one of several figures who really coalesced what has now become many generations of scholars and thinkers. And I thank him for that work as well. And I recognize many of you in the room because of that magnet-like presence that he engendered in our community. So thank you, Patty.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. I want to remind everyone to please keep your comments so everyone here has a chance to under 2 minutes. And also, if you could please tell us where you're coming from. And next up will be Janet Walker.
Hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Patty, and thank you so much, members of this beautiful community, for convening. I'm really appreciating hearing from everyone. I was never actually introduced to Brian. I don't think we encountered each other on that many occasions, but I feel I have always known him. And I remember reading his Sight and Sound piece from 1981, Was Hitler Really There?, when I was, I think, a teaching assistant in a class on documentary. And also, as Alex was just saying, that the tradition of the victim and Gersonian documentaries. And they really were very meaningful to me back at a time when I was trying to think through these various thoughts. And I just want to say that the currency of his ideas, his, as everyone is saying, his charisma, his intellectual verve, and the currency and endurance of his ideas has been absolutely remarkable, because still today, when students are grappling with these same issues that he was talking about back in the day. And so there was one time when I did encounter him 30 years after knowing him and feeling embraced within his his intellectual and personal spirit and community building. So 30 years later, I ended up doing some work on the Louisiana Gulf Coast and documentary post-Katrina and beyond, post-BP spill of the Louisiana Gulf Coast. And so in talking about Louisiana stories, I thought, oh, I better talk about Louisiana Story, the Flaherty film. And so I thought, but how can I possibly do this when Brian Winston so well knew Ricky Leacock and had known his life and work over so much time, and is even mentioned in Richard Leacock's Wikipedia page. And so how can I do this? So I go up, and part of the talk was on Louisiana Story, not even a documentary, of course, but nevertheless. And then afterwards, he approaches, and I think, oh no, what did I get wrong? How have I done this? And he says to me, she even knew where the spider web was shot. In other words, I had gotten the spider web right. And I thought, okay, it's been 30 years of knowing his work and this person. And even though we're, maybe about half a generation removed, but really mostly contemporaries, I felt that 30 years later, I'd received Brian Winston's blessing. And I thought, okay, that's it. I've done my bit. I've arrived. I'm fine now because I've been embraced within his intellectual and personal ambit. So thank you everyone for.
Thank you, Janet. That's beautiful. And as I remind everyone, say please where you are and try to keep it under 2 minutes. We've got a lot of hands coming up here. Charles Musser.
Yes, I'm based right now in New Haven, Connecticut, often in New York. I had the experience of my first class in documentary studies was one I took with Brian in like around 1979, 1980, just as he was beginning to teach. It was in this medium-sized lecture room in the Stern School of Business at NYU, sort of in the bowels of that building. He was incredibly dynamic, memorable. I hesitate to say this, but I felt like that he was still developing his repertoire, and sort of near the end, it was getting to be a little familiar. But this was very early in his teaching and writing, a relative writing career. And so that course was then, Brian left NYU, and it was taken over by George Stoney. And then, somewhat unexpectedly, in the late 80s, I ended up teaching that course for 2 years. And one of the most disconcerting things for me was I found myself really ventriloquizing Brian Winston for quite some time. I mean, eventually I found my own voice, but it started by me speaking Brian Winston speak. He was obviously at that time, look at it now, he was 10 years older than me. When you're in your 20s, 10 years means a lot. And so I was definitely a student of his, and then I, followed him. And as I taught other courses in documentary, I began to, and increasingly, in fact, assign his writing in my courses, both my documentary filmmaking course and also my documentary studies course. The victim in documentary and others about narrative in documentary. But for me then, what was a kind of pleasure was, as we all matured and grew up, is that, Brian went from being like a teacher, my teacher, to becoming a friend. And I was very pleased that I had the honor and pleasure of celebrating his last few birthdays in New York with Gail and with Jane Gaines and with Balfung, and it was so it was really a kind of that movement from being a student when he was just beginning to be like actually chairing and taking over, trying to straighten out things at NYU, to being a close and lucky friend.
Thank you so much for that, Charlie. I hear that Jill Godmillow is trying to talk, but I don't see you in your electronic hands. So if you'd like to say a few words, that would be great. If you're here. No? Okay, we'll wait for you in a moment. And then we have Marty Lucas next.
Hi, folks. I'm Marty Lucas. I'm in New York, and yeah, I guess we all share this, but Brian was so amazing, but there's a huge sense of loss for me. That I haven't heard described yet. So it's very important for me. I met Brian in the mid-1970s. I was an undergraduate student when he first came to NYU. And between him and George Stoney, I guess I had gone there to a school that most of the people wanted to go to Hollywood, which I never really wanted to do. And I decided to become a documentary filmmaker, something that I did actually, and spent a lot of my life doing. And the first part of that was really with group Paper Tiger Television. And so I managed to stay in touch with Brian. He did a wonderful show with us, reading the news, where his wit really did emerge, I think, in a kind of a wonderful way. I think it was, we did the roll up on the monitor, and it said March 16th, 1983. And he said, stop tape, stop tape. And he said, that's the only real fact you're going to get out of this news show. And then he took it from there. He had a very incisive wit. I didn't see him that often after that. He moved back to the UK eventually. I saw him at Harrow. I saw him at Lincoln. And then it wasn't really till, I guess, around 2000, I started teaching documentary production and documentary studies. And we kind of reconnected. He spoke at several conferences at Hunter, where I teach. And of course, I was seeing him at the Visible Evidence and other events. And it was just like we picked up, almost like we left off, you know, just that voice, you know, I can hear him, you know, saying, hey, Malty, you know, in this way that invites you to kind of be yourself. I think that's it for me. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Marty. We have next, let's see, David Hutchison coming in from, looks like Glasgow. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's from the west of Scotland, though. I'm associated with the Glasgow Caledonian University. Brian is a guy with whom my paths intersected from about 1975 on. No one's mentioned so far the bad news story when a group of sociologists at Glasgow University analysed a lot of BBC and ITV news coverage about industrial relations, and the broadcasters got very upset about what they had to say. And I was very lucky in that Brian and his colleagues agreed to do a presentation of this work, an early presentation at what was then the Glasgow College of Technology. And what I remember about it is, of course, the energy and what became the ferociousness, which actually went on to lead to an interchange between one of Brian's colleagues and a BBC Scotland journalist that night on the Scottish television news. My path intersected later on. I was an external examiner at Westminster when he taught there, and I was also at Lincoln doing some work. My last involvement with Brian was when just very recently with other folk, I was co-editing a book about another very distinguished broadcaster and academic, a man called Stuart Hood. And my colleague and I wanted to get Brian aboard writing about Stuart Hood's media books, the books of analysis about the media that Hood wrote, like Brian, from the point of view of a practitioner as well as a theorist. And it fell through. Brian wasn't able to do that in the end, and we were disappointed. But the wonderful thing is, one of the very first reviews we got, And a very nice review, indeed, a very helpful review, shall we say, was in the British Journalism Review by Brian Winston. And one remains very grateful for that.
Thank you, David. Very nice. Annabelle Leverton.
Hi, I'm afraid I missed the beginning of this, so I hope I'm not repeating what anybody else has said. But I knew Brian in 1961 in my first term at Oxford, and he was, I think, a year ahead of me. And we remained friends ever since. And he was an extraordinary friend, incredibly supportive to me as I moved into the acting world. And when I lived in New York in '68, and he was working, I think, for World in Action there, he would find excuses to interview me so I could get £5, have a meal. Because I was pretty poverty stricken then. And he's always been extraordinarily supportive of my work. And then I started in about 2000, I started coaching people to present themselves in public as well as doing acting. And he brought me on board in Westminster and then later in Lincoln to do what he said was the other half of what he did. He would wake them up to what the principles really were on journalism and how to face people in studios. And I would be the practical side, getting them to breathe and speak and not be frightened. And he was, oh, you do your stuff now. You better do your stuff. And he would allow me to do really silly things to relax people. But he totally appreciated it and made sure that I was on board, which was lovely of him, and the clarity with which he laid out what journalism stems from and how long it's been going and how news has always been fake and how to manage it and how to manage yourself within it was an absolute object lesson in how to teach a rather complicated subject. And he always spoke, though he didn't always write in the clearest, simplest way from my point of view, but he always spoke on radio and with his students and with people like the people we were coaching to do interviews on television. He always spoke with a simplicity and a directness which made people, he was just so human. And yeah, I can't really believe he's not with us. I'm expecting him to pop up any minute now. Thank you.
Thank you, Annabelle. Let's see, before we're getting to 5 minutes before the hour, before we go to Mandy Rose, is there anybody else who'd like to step up for a couple of minutes? Let's see, we have Sarah Elder from Buffalo.
Hi, very quickly, and this is very, very moving. I just wanted to say very quickly, I only had him as a teacher very shortly, but I think he was the only person who really taught me, the victim analysis. I made films in Alaska for 40 years and I teach documentary, but it was Ricky Leacock, George Stoney, and Brian, all a 10-year generation ahead of me, that actually changed my life. Still does, still all of the people I've documented in Alaska, the Alaska Native people. And he's just extraordinary. He gathered all of the threads from all of the areas that we come from, and somehow he put them all together and wove such a beautiful life and consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Laura Roscaroli from Ireland.
Sorry, hi, thank you all. I'll be very quick. I just want to remember the very last time that I saw Brian, which was on the 8th of September 2021. We were both speaking together at an online conference on the films of Adam Curtis. But what matters to me to say is that he gave his talk while being minded, buying horses and being sort of surrounded by medical implements. And the image that will always stay with me is that, and is the image of how even in that situation, he managed to embody his Brianness to the full, his project with conviction, with extreme conviction, his lucidity, his critical spirit, and the sense of what truly mattered to him. So that's how I'm going to remember him forever.
Thank you, Laura. Judith Aston.
I just want to add, I mean, everything people have said about his extreme generosity, his humor, his irascibility, enthusiasm, and above all, solidarity. I found, Brian came to our first IDOCS conference in 2011. He came to everyone subsequently. He's just been a tremendous supporter of what we were trying to do. And one thing we haven't mentioned, but I found him a real inspiration, the way he's managed to navigate his way through institutions, and which, isn't always easy, especially, the contemporary situation a lot of us find ourselves in, trying to stand up for what we believe in, trying to really, stay true to our students, stay true to our subject. And Brian was just total inspiration in that. And I always felt, his last words to me were sort of, the latest thing that you're doing, I really appreciate it, really appreciate IDOCS, I really appreciate everything that, you're trying to do. And I just felt he was always there, and that you could always, rely on Brian to endorse, but not in an unthinking way, to be a critical friend, a really good, supportive, critical friend. And let's keep that going. This community is a very good place where we can keep that spirit alive, because it's really important. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Judith. And we have Jessica in London.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brian's daughter. I'm not going to share any. Oh, and this is his eldest grandson. Sorry, it's all a bit much, obviously, but I just wanted to say thank you. Dad would have absolutely have loved this. So that was all I wanted to say, really, was just thank you very, very much. Sorry.
Oh, Jessica, thank you for coming on. Let's see. I hope we can hear from Richard Kilbourne.
Richard, we need you to unmute.
Please unmute.
Sorry about that. This is Richard from Stirling in central Scotland. Known Brian for several decades. I just wanted actually to highlight one particular memory of Brian that speaks volumes about the man. I think this was at a visible evidence gathering in Los Angeles, must have been sort of the late 1990s. And I was sitting next to Brian in a huge auditorium. And this was soon after Brian had had quite a serious bypass operation. And he'd been required by his doctors to keep a low profile, something that Brian found extremely difficult to do. And I've sort of felt him squirming in his seat beside me. And after about 15 minutes of squirming, he rose from his seat and made his way to the aisle, and then to the front of the hall. And then he politely interrupted the speakers on the platform, and then proceeded to explain that he'd been required by his doctors as a part of his recuperation process to take exercise every 15 minutes. And this was him giving due warning to those in the auditorium that they would, every 15 minutes, see him sort of get up and walk around the hall in order just simply to follow the advice of his consultant, you know. And this was a wonderful way, I felt, that Brian had of, in spite of being required to keep a low profile, you know, that he was jolly well certain he was going to make his presence felt, you know. And that's an abiding memory for me. And yes, I will miss him greatly, and still feel, like many others have said, that he is very much a living presence with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Anybody else who would like to step up? Well, yes?
No, I think Mandy.
Yeah, we'll get to Mandy right now, and then Patty will end our little celebration here. So Mandy, who is in Bristol.
Hi, so I couldn't trust myself to extemporize, so I've written something down. So yes, first to send condolences to Gail and to Jessica. Thanks for being with us here today. I too find it really hard to believe that Brian's not still with us. So when I was thinking about what to say today, a story that I'd heard Brian tell more than once came to mind, and which was the subject, in fact, of one of our last email exchanges. Many of you will know it, but I'll tell it briefly now in Brian's memory for those of you that don't. So in the mid-60s, John Adair and Sol Worth decided to research how Navajo people might use film in the canonical study published as Through Navajo Eyes. They traveled to Pine Ridge, Arizona, where Adair had done his doctoral research on Navajo silversmiths, to meet with Sam Yazzie, an elder he knew, to ask his permission to go ahead. And I'm just going to read quickly for just a paragraph in the book. So through a local translator, they explained their plan. When Adair finished, Sam thought for a while and then turned to Worth and asked a lengthy question, which was interpreted as, will making movies do the sheep any harm? Worth was happy to explain that as far as he knew, there was no chance that making movies would harm the sheep. Sam thought this over and then asked, will making movies do the sheep good? Worth was forced to reply that as far as he knew, making movies wouldn't do the sheep any good. Sam thought this over, then, looking round at us, he said, then why make movies? It's a funny story and touches on so many themes in media making and in research around cultural translation, misunderstanding, power, media effects, ethics, the responsibility to the subject of research and of documentary. The story is humbling. It turns the tables on us as Sam Yazzie questions the academics. It troubles easy assumptions about the value of scholarship, of media making, and it opens onto issues of media participation, many themes that recurred in Brian's writing. I don't remember him unpacking of any of that when he told the story. He'd just put it out there in a conference discussion, say, and it would work to reframe the conversation, bringing the subject of media into the room, puncturing some techno-deterministic line of thought, perhaps. Brian didn't tell us what to make of it. It's an ambiguous story. It opens questions, one of Brian's many gifts to us as a colleague and a teacher. So thank you, Brian. We miss you.
Thank you so much, Mandy, for that beautiful piece. And I think we have a few more, and we will continue with Deng.
I'm Feng Bao. I'm a professor at Northeast Normal University in China. I'm probably the only one in China. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. So I just want to say thank you, because I remember I met Brian Winston in 2012 in Beijing Normal University when he was giving a lecture there. And then I invited him in Changchun about 4 years later. So he gave a series lectures to our students, and he's always energetic and generous to us. I remember he's always say that, don't spend time. I was trying to take him to some sightseeing in Changchun. He said, next time. So, yeah, and then he's very supportive to us, and he's saying that I could help you to fund a documentary research center, and that's something you should do in China. So then, let me just see if I could switch my camera. I'll try. I have some technical problem, but I want to show some pictures of that when he visited in Changchun. That's my school, in front of our school, and he was giving a lecture to our students. He will always be surrounded by the students. He's always like a big star. And he was given invitation certificate by our president. And he's looking at his poster in our media lab. So then I want to say that 4 years later, no, 2 years later, 4 years ago, that we did the documentary research center supported by Brian. And then they turned out the last trip of Brian's in China. Here's some photo. And I saw Wang Shi is online, but I don't know if I missed the Wang Shi's talk. So this is turned out the first international documentary conference held in Changchun, and maybe in China too.
Fang, sorry to interrupt, but I wonder if you could wrap it up so we can get the last speaker in. Thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, I just want to say thank you. Thanks to Brian's contribution to the Chinese documentary scholarship. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fang. And we'd like to wrap it up with Gail Vanstone. Thank you.
Okay, just one word. Thank you, Patty, for organizing this. And thank you for everyone who is here. I've heard Brian speak of you with admiration and with affection many, many times, and he would love to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gail. And I'd like to not really close, but just offer that on behalf of our entire organizing team, we send our deep condolences to all of Brian's family, to Gail, and to all of his colleagues gathered here and those who are here only in spirit. His death has truly left a hole and a great absence, not only in our field, but as we know from Fang and people coming from all over the world in the universe. These holes can never be filled, but holes and absences can be ignited for the future with words, ideas, communities, and solidarities that carry on Brian's amazing, powerful presence and commitment, not only to the field, but to all of us. I feel that Brian is here with us today because growing up Irish Catholic, we don't believe in borders between the living and the dead. There are those who are here and there are those who are with us, but we can't see them. So I'd like to thank all of you who have joined us today as participants and keen listeners. I'd like to thank everyone who has shared stories that are just so moving. I have to echo Gail and copy her. I think Brian would have loved this, and I feel his spirit lives on in all of you. We're going to have a 10-minute Brian-style informal hangout after I finish speaking. And we hope some of you will stay on the line and just join us in conviviality. In closing, I'd really like to thank the large team that helped make this event happen. Helen DeMichelle, Mandy Rose, Judith Aston, Dorit Nauman, Liz Miller, Sandra Gaudenzi, and Elisa LeBeau. It took many, many hands to bring this into play in the virtual world. And I deeply thank the people from the co-creation team. And in closing, I deeply thank Brian Winston for all he has given us. And now at last, everybody, you can unmute and we'll just move into 10 minutes of informal hellos. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
And our next 10 minutes won't be recorded.
Yes, let's stop the recording. Who's ever in charge of that?